Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. I'm producer Steve Ryder. Here's one good thing about being stuck at home during the present crisis. We all have more time to do a little thinking. What is it that really matters to us? Is every area of our life, work, relationships, lifestyle, all truly under the lordship and love of Jesus? In this age of constant distraction, how do we live a truly integrated life where we actually live out what we believe and know to be true? To help us walk through these questions, John Stonestreet welcomes Regent College professor Dr. Stephen Garber to the BreakPoint Podcast. Dr. Garber is the author of an outstanding new book, The Seamless Life, A Tapestry of Love and Learning, Worship and Work. Here's John Stonestreet with Dr. Stephen Garber.
Well, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. I am just really excited about today's conversation with someone that I have considered a friend for longer than I have known him. And that is because one of Stephen Garber's earliest books was just incredibly formative for me. If you're an educator and you have not read The Fabric of Faithfulness, it's a must read. I think I may be, Steve, the title holder for the one who's recommended that book the most in history, because I just think is so helpful, and it really gets to the heart of the sort of thing that you care deeply about, which was its connections. That subtitle of that book is How to Connect Belief and Behavior. And I am excited to have Steve Garber on the podcast today because his new book is called The Seamless Life. Yes, you can hear that same sort of theme, making these connections. The subtitle, A Tapestry of Love and Learning and Worship and Work. If you don't know about Stephen Garber, you should. He is professor of marketplace theology and the director of the program in leadership, theology and society at Regent College. For a long time, he lived near Washington, D.C. He's been a professor and educator and mentor in many senses of the word. His books include Visions of Vocation and like the one that I mentioned, as I said, the one that I mentioned earlier, The Fabric of Faithfulness. And Dr. Stephen Garber, it's great to have you on the BreakPoint Podcast.
It's good to talk with you, John, and I actually do hope you're the record holder, and I'd be happy to actually note that was finally and fully true.
Well, good. I don't know if there's a prize associated with it or just a badge of honor, but it really is a terrific book. And so is this, The Seamless Life. It's so readable. I read it, I think, in just, a couple of hours, but it's also something that you want to go back. In fact, I'm having my daughter go back and just read it. She's 14 years old, just kind of coming into thinking about who is she, what does she want to be, what does she want to do, what kind of person, at that level that you think of, kind of at that stage of your life. And each chapter kind of stands alone, but all of them are connected around this theme of kind of living integrated life. That's been a passion of yours for a really, really long time. Talk about that a little bit. Why do you care so much about that? And why do you want us to care so much about that?
It's a good question, John, and we could talk for hours about that. Thinking that you are calling me from the Colson Center and what Chuck Colson represented for the church and the world in his own time. I remember some years ago getting a telephone call from Prison Fellowship when they were still located in Reston, Virginia. And the question was, would you come talk to our headquarters staff here one morning about this question? Is it possible to have a contemplative life and still live in Washington, D.C.? And, of course, Washington, D.C., for all its glories and shames, is a city known for its metro system and its escalators going up and down and full of people from, of course, the city itself, but also from Des Moines and Colorado Springs and Timbuktu, who are coming to see the city for a few days. And anybody who lives there knows that there are two sides to the escalator, those who are, on their way to solve the problems of the world in 5 minutes, so get out of the way, and those who are there visiting from someplace else who just want to see the city. So the question was, in this very busy place of Washington, D.C., can you have a contemplative life too? And so I took with me actually two first edition books which are prized to me by Abraham Kuyper. And one was his, his great book, which argues that every square inch of the whole of reality belongs to Jesus, who alone is Lord. But then there was a lesser-known book called To Be Near Unto God, which is a book of 110 meditations on one phrase from Psalm 73. It is good to live near unto God. And what I was arguing for that morning was that, yes, that question was answerable. There was a good answer to it, that you could be in a very busy political center, capital city of the world, place like Washington, D.C., full of all kinds of, hopes and dreams and good things and not so good things, and try to hold on to the integrity of your heart. It's possible to be here and to be somebody deeply formed by intimacy with God, by a true knowledge of God. So I would say in some ways those themes have run through my life with frailty, because I'm a frail man, but I've longed for them and hoped for them and tried to live by them for a long time.
Well, I mean, we live in a culture of such disintegration, right? And I think even right now, dealing with the pandemic the way that we have been, it's further disintegrated our lives, in a sense, even more. But, what is behind the disintegration in our culture that pulls us in so many different directions and gets in the way of kind of bringing all of our life together under Christ's lordship and leadership and love?
Again, this is a long take a walk together conversation to have, John. On the one hand, like most everything else in the whole of the world, goes back to Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. And I would say clearly we were born into sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, into a world that God intended to be. It should be like this. It's very good. It's so good. It's good. It's good. It's good. It's good, really. This idea of a life lived before the face of God in responsible relationship to each other and to the creation around. It's through imagery, and it isn't fully borne out at the time, of course, but we do have the picture clearly of this is the world that God intended to be. The fall radically, deconstructs that in the classical sense of the word, but also in the contemporary sense of the word. It deconstructs the coherence that God intended. But I would say at the very heart of that, of the sin that was born into the human race and into all of creation at that point, was there was a division between what we know and what we do. And, about this in other places, but I've come to see that strangely named tree of the knowledge of good and evil as what I've called an epistemological temptation with a moral heart, which is a mouthful, I recognize. But I'll say it again, an epistemological temptation with a moral heart, which, to put it more simply, is what are you going to do with what you know? And I would say that everything we have lived with as human beings ever since then is born out of the hope and the heartache of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. We can look at contemporary analyses of, the world we live in today. I was leading my students through Leslie Newbegin's book, Proper Confidence, this week. And he identifies, the history of the Enlightenment project and the dualisms that come out of Western culture of, theory and practice and mind and body and objective and subjective and facts and values. And, we could dig into every one of those, versions of dualism and see that there's a fragmentation born of, how we see ourselves in the world, how we make sense of ourselves in the world. So easily speak about, theoretically speaking, you see, but as if somehow it's possible to believe in theories that don't have practical meaning. And even the very division in language betrays a dualism, betrays a fragmentation, which isn't really ours as Christian people.
But that's one of the features of the modern world, is to so experience incoherence. It's to believe that coherence itself isn't possible. That seems to me to be, the kind of the postmodern ethos. Certainly, we look at analytical tools that are used on college campuses, whether it's critical theory in its various forms or, just our attempts to amuse ourselves to death, right? To distract ourselves from the drudgery of life. I mean, that is a big temptation that I think happens to our culture, but it's one probably that Christians don't realize we get sucked in as well.
I think that's exactly right. I began my class actually on this Zoom online forum that we're having to use now by talking about the film a few years ago called Eye in the Sky, which is a film about British and American, military political leadership trying to figure out what to do to stop a terrorist in the Middle East. And the drama of the story is about, 21st century technology and what we can see and know about what's going on in the world, and particularly what the ability of drone warfare means for how we, are getting involved in the troubles of the world. And these high-level, bureaucrats in the military and the state who are with honest heart, trying to figure out what do we do to stop this evil that is going to be perpetrated. And the drama, again, of the story is, now that we know what we know, what are we going to do about this? And my looking at it was particularly to look at the problem of what I call disembodied knowing, that we can know things so far away from them as we are. And even with the recognition that life and death is on the line, and there are no simple answers because there just aren't any in most military issues of the world, there's a sense in which, that nobody actually wins at the end of the day because of the heartache of disembodied knowing, where we, can know, but in some ways we don't really know either, in that more Hebrew and Christian sense.
Right. So, and not only that, nobody wins at the end of the day, but there's really no such things as good guys and bad guys, anymore either. And look, you just got a taste, by the way, of the sort of way that Steve Garber leads us on this journey through this idea of a seamless life. When that is through a incredible array and variety of references and stories and things like that. I don't know any other book, Steve, that I've ever read that goes from, Colorado cowboys, to DC life, to great Russian literature, to films, some of which I've heard of, some of which I haven't, to U2, to beautiful works of art, and of course the entire book itself, and something I haven't mentioned yet, is trying to pull together the spoken word and the imagination through image with some photographs that you've taken in your journeys, which introduce these stories and everything from, natural landscapes to historical buildings, sacred and governmental, and everything else in between. This is one of those kind of you practice what you preach, trying to see connections in all of these things. And I got to the end of the book thinking to myself, he just covered like every ground of human experience there was in one way or another. But certainly that's got to underlie your belief that all of this stuff is in Christ and created, by God as part of the human experience and therefore part of who we are. And so you've really tried to embody that not only in what you've written, but how you've written it.
Well, John, thanks be to God if I've done that. I wanted to do that. I did want to do that. And if you've seen that, then thanks be to God. You mentioned the Colorado part, and because you're calling me from Colorado, I thought maybe I would just underscore that part of the story and the question you asked me a few minutes ago. But the first essay, and then one later one, actually are born of my own Colorado birth and my history there generationally. But sometimes people ask me, so why does this all matter to you like this, Steve? And I could say a lot of things, but I often, without a blush, without even a blink, I would just simply say, my grandfather's life, helped me to begin to think about these things. And one of the stories I've told is about, going to a livestock auction in southwestern Colorado, the very southwesternmost city of Colorado. It's called Cortez. It's near the Four Corners, and it's a wondrous and glorious and far away place for most people who imagine America. And my grandfather was a cattle buyer for most of his life, and I loved going with him to these cattle auctions, and he was a very smart man, a very gifted man. And one day I was about a 10-year-old, so we didn't really have a big conversation about it afterwards, but sitting there in the Cortez livestock auction, and the auctioneer was going through his selling of all the different kinds of cattle and came to a division between this one kind of a grade of cattle and another kind. He stopped his auctioneer's, call, and he said to my grandfather out among the other buyers, said, Mr. Gilchrist, what are these cattle selling for this week? And I remember as a 10-year-old, just like, isn't that interesting that you asked my grandfather, one of the buyers, and my grandfather was a math whiz, just a genius really with math. He could have just quickly, very easily, offered a number that was different than what the true number was. But he knew my grandfather would know the number, know the price that throughout Colorado cows were selling for this week. But he also trusted my grandfather to tell him the truth about it. So it happened in a blink of an eye, really. It wasn't a long interaction. But I began thinking even then, and years later, I thought a lot more about this. I knew that my grandfather would lead us as a family, night by night, literally on our knees, praying for the world. And we would literally get onto our knees in their living room, and we would pray. And I began, years later, putting together images like St. Benedict's Ora e Labora, to pray and to work, and realizing that this idea of a more seamless life, a more coherent life, which runs through church history, was really embodied in my grandfather's life. That somebody who night by night would get on his knees literally to pray with his wife, my grandmother, and grandchildren and children about the things of the world. But that he would walk into his work the next day and through the years of his life, and people who knew him and knew their work would trust my grandfather to be a man of unusual integrity and really good at what he did. And so the idea that somehow we could hold this together, I would say in many ways was born of my early apprenticeship to my grandfather.
Steve Ryder here again. I hope you're enjoying John's discussion with Dr. Stephen Garber, author of The Seamless Life, a tapestry of love and learning, worship and work. If you'd like to receive a copy of The Seamless Life, we'd be happy to send it to you when you make a gift of any amount to BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Simply come to breakpoint.org/Garber. That's breakpoint.org/GARBER. Now, let's get back to John Stonestreet and Dr. Stephen Garber.
You know, there's two things about that story, Steve, that as I read both of those chapters that just spoke to me, not only because, I do live in Colorado. And, when you visited our church to lead a weekend, you told so many great Colorado stories. And I love this place, and I know you love this place. And even though Cortez, that's real Colorado. I mean, Colorado Springs is good Colorado, but when you're talking about, the place you're talking about is the real deal. But also, I grew up on a farm, and my dad farmed cattle, and so did my grandfather. And
I didn't know that, John. I didn't know that.
It's true. And I actually have been to cattle auctions, and I had the experience of, early on with my dad, even just seeing in the way he reacted to people and the way he talked to people and the way people talked to him, who was honest and who wasn't, and who was, cutting corners here or cutting corners there. And it is something like you that always struck with me. And the other part of this too, Steve, is that my father's dad is the grandfather that I did not know. He died when I was 6 months old, and my middle name is Blair, which was his first name and is my dad's middle name and is now my son's middle name. And my dad intentionally took me back into the mountains of West Virginia where my grandfather was. And I met a lot of people who knew my grandfather. And there is a way when people heard my grandfather's name that they reacted that always gave me great pride and respect because he was a good man. And he marked me with his name, or my dad, I guess, marked me with his father's name. And I never knew him, but I could never escape it. And so I marked my son with his name and with his other grandfather's name, or my other grandfather's name, who he will never know, so that he can't escape it. And there is something about that. And I just, look, what I love about this book is that we don't get enough time to stop and think how everything connects, how all of you cover beauty, you cover business. You talk about the Mars Corporation, several ways in which, the company that makes M&Ms is trying to think about their work differently. You talk about literature and theater, and you talk about disappointment and family and struggle and heartache and pain. And first of all, that brings me to two conclusions. Number one is, if you're trying to figure out how all this goes together and you haven't stopped and just thought this is a catalytic book for you, and you should pick it up, and I'm going to tell you how here as the podcast continues. But also, Steve, I wanted to get to this point of it, which is there's probably folks listening that think because the culture is so disintegrating, that's impossible. And you approach a word, you throw out a word throughout the book, and it's one of your favorite words. Anybody that knows Steve Garber knows that he talks about the word proximate a lot. Take us through that journey of being proximate. What do you mean by that?
Well, John, it's such a good question, and I wish we had a long time to talk about it together. But, principally, it's born of my own life in this now but not yet world, where I believe all things have been made new, and yet even the creation groans, and I groan too. It's the way that we just don't see it that way. It's, as you've used the word, it's so disintegrated. The way we live in our lives are so prone to disintegration, and that's true for all of us, really. And I wish it wasn't, and I groan against it, but it is. I think I first began to think about that word in a particular way some years ago when I was asked by a magazine if I would write an article for them on this question. They said, "You've been living in Washington, D.C. for a long time. Is there a vocation in the political world?" And so I spent a summer thinking about it and finally offered them an essay that I called Making Peace with Proximate Justice. And what I argued was that if you're going to actually have a sense of calling into the political world that is sustainable, you're going to have to make peace with proximate justice, was how I argued it, which I meant that we don't live in any part of life with this being the only choice, all or nothing. If we imagine that's in fact the way it is, we will inevitably find nothing because all is never possible. It just isn't in any part of life, really. We don't have no access on this side of eternity to everything being right, all being as it ought to be. We do believe in the story of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. And that's the meta-narrative which we give ourselves to with heart and mind. So if you're going to stay at a vocation in the political world, you're going to have to figure out some way to try to work for what's right and good and true and just, but realize that when it's all said and done on this side, of the consummation, everything won't have happened, actually. I think about, your founder, Colson, watching his life for a long, long time. And, of course, it's born of, in some ways, his own incarceration. And as he writes through it in his earlier writings about sitting on the floor of the prison, thinking, how did I get here? What happened in my life? What choices I make that I got here? And it's a forlorn moment for his life. But, it's a story which we've been all listening to for a generation now of what happened, in his own coming to honest faith. But, first of all, of course, getting involved with prisoners like you've been. How do you somehow step into the life of prisoners who are forlorn and forsaken and remember them somehow? And then not so many years into it all, with help people like Dan Van Ness and others, they begin to think, well, individual prisoners are a great need that has to be addressed, but the whole system isn't right. Penal systems in the world are not right. So, Justice Fellowship was born in to help out Prison Fellowship. And for all of the good work that's happened to those two banners over the years, people still groan, things are not right in the world. Things still don't get done as they ought to get done. And what are you going to do? You can either decide, well, I'm going to go home then, and I won't try. I tried this, but it didn't work out. Or you're going to stick with it somehow, believing that to do something, which in my word is the word proximate, to do something that's right and good and true and just matters in God's world. For those who are perplexed by that think, well, that's a long ways from my life, I will simply ask the question, how about in your marriage? Is it possible actually to believe in, something good and true and right in marriage? Even after 2 weeks of being married, or 3 years, or 10 years, or 25 years, you realize that all the dreams and hopes you had for a perfect marriage didn't work out. And what are you going to do if it isn't perfect? Well, is it possible to believe in proximate happiness, in honest and true and real happiness, even if it isn't everything?
And then it points us to the ultimate happiness, and that's really this way that Plato was close with his forms, but not close enough, that there is a reflection here of ultimate beauty, ultimate truth, ultimate justice. The good news is that the wall between the two worlds, the world of the forms and the world of our experience, the phenomenon that we have to deal with, isn't this hard fixed wall, that Christ himself has broken through it and revealed it to us. And this is how the dualisms of the world really collapse. That certainly there's a distance between heaven and earth, between the proximate and the fully restored and redeemed. But the proximate gives us an insight. We're not left, as celebrities were a few weeks ago, singing the song Imagine in an attempt to grasp some sense of, meaning and hope. There's actually more to this, and we can actually access things that are higher than us and truer and good and beautiful. That's what I love about your writing, Steve. The Fabric of Faithfulness is much more didactic. It's a work for educators and still has that flavor of a million different sources and angles to look at something. But to read The Seamless Life for me was an experience. It's not didactic. You certainly do some teaching, but you invite us into a way of thinking and imagining the kind of world that we live in and that we often forget. I just think it's a masterful thing. And at a time right now when so many of us are stuck at home and not able to go anywhere and, forced to have some time on our hands, I think it could be a great way really to redeem the time. One chapter that I want to get into, I've tried not to give people kind of, too much because the experience is worth the book. And again, it's called The Seamless Life, a tapestry of love and learning, worship and work. And it's kind of our featured resource here this month at the Colson Center. If you come to breakpoint.org, we'll tell you how to get a copy of that book. Of course, you can also pick it up at Amazon or any place like that. Steve, you have a chapter in there about fathers. It moved me because I have been the father of daughters for a while, but as many of our folks know, just over the last 2.5 years, became the father of a son, unexpectedly, surprise. And you recommended there a set of books, Helmut Teleke's book, talking about Henry Nouwen's on the Prodigal Son, a book that you caused me to buy and read, which was way bigger than I thought it was when I bought it, which is The Father's Tale by Michael O'Brien, A Father's Tale, kind of a retelling of the prodigal son. You know, we're coming up against Father's Day, and you talk about the disconnect here between a father's love and what he's able to actually connect with his sons on, and that this is kind of the experience of fathers. And I read it and got a sense of this proximate hope that we were talking about. But I don't know if there's a question here other than I just appreciated it and hoping maybe you could talk us through it a little bit.
Yeah, so John, again, I mean, all the questions you asked are such good questions. You're very good at this, John Stonestreet.
Well, I'm hoping we can someday take a walk and then we can have this longer conversation, and maybe we can still record it for everyone else. But this is your time to proximately answer the question that take longer.
Well, I mean, biologically speaking, we don't exist in the world without having fathers. However, full of grace and hope it is, or however hurtful and wounded it is. And it's just true for all of us. And, we are taught to pray, Our Father who art in heaven, which is the prayer we pray all over the face of the earth, day after day and year after year. There's something about, the relation of children to father, which is profound and mysterious, and we understand, but we don't understand what it means, of course. We're marked by it for blessing and for curse in life as human beings. And, in that essay, I did, the Nowen, book is a better known one to most of us, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And the shortest version of the story is that Nowen decided he would live for years of his life with thinking about himself as the first son, the son, the prodigal, we call him, who went off to the distant land. And then finally someone says to him, Henry, that isn't you. You're the second son. You're the judgmental son. He says, really? And he thought, I am, aren't I, really? For the next years of his life, thinking he was about the second son. Well, I'm going to cut to the chase here very quickly, where the book is profound in its own eloquent, insightful way. But finally someone says to him along his life, Henry, you've missed the point of the story for all these years, The point isn't to be the first or the second son, it's to become the father. And it's to realize, in fact, you've been forgiven, you've been graced, and you are to give grace like the Father gives grace. That's, of course, where the story begins in Jesus' own teaching in the Gospels. What does it mean to forgive? How many times should I forgive? Helmut Thielicke, the great German preacher, theologian, has a wonderful book of sermons on the parables of Jesus, simply titled The Waiting Father. And I often go back to that, actually. He was a profoundly gifted pastor in his own day. But this book, A Father's Tale by Michael O'Brien, it's about 1,000 pages, so you'd have to actually take a deep breath before you started it and realize it's going to take you a while. But as John said about himself, he's been reading it steadfastly, and I did that too. I may have made a choice years ago during the season of Lent that I would try to find something to read that would probe my soul, that would ask me deeper questions about myself and who I am before God. And I have read a number of O'Brien's novels during Lent over the years, and that was one of them. It's his own retelling, I would say, of the story Jesus tells of the prodigal son. There's a father. He has two sons, and one goes this way, one goes this way. And it's a long, long story of, a father's love for his sons. And I wouldn't say this proudly or with any maudlin sense about it at all, but I remember being in a plane one day with the book, and just breaking into tears and just feeling like I had been spoken to at a deeper level in my life than I typically am. The father that I am, we have 5 children and 10 grandchildren, and people often have asked me over the years, so how are you, Steve? How are your kids doing? Which is a big question to ask and to answer honestly. And I almost always have said for many years, I wake in the morning with my children in my throat. I don't know how else to describe it, John, than that realizing that all my hoping for my children, all my praying for my children, and they're deep inside my own soul, and I long for them. I love them. I want good things for them. I pray for them. Their cares become my cares, of course. Not only now my children, but my grandchildren, their cares become my cares. So in some way, this idea of father and now grandfather, is deep for all of us, for hope and heartache, for blessing and for curse. And so to somehow get our hearts around a redemptive image of what it means to father and why it matters so much is very, very important.
Well, my guest today on the BreakPoint Podcast has been Stephen Garber, professor of marketplace theology and the director of the program in leadership theology and society at Regent College in Vancouver. Steve, I want to thank you. You've long been a mentor to me, certainly way before I ever had the privilege of meeting you. and talking with you. There have been a couple moments over the last couple years where I can say you've been in particular encouraging to me, not just from a distance, but with proximate words, and I want to thank you for that. And this book really is an experience. It's a journey, and it's something, if you want to find ways that life fits together, after Eden, but still, as Calvin would say, coram Deo, before God. This is a journey through that. It's short, readable chapters that, again, weave their way through history, theology, theater, literature, farming, agriculture, parenting, and all in a way that just makes you sit deeper into that which is true and good, but without hiding, without escaping from the brokenness that is certainly the very real part of the world that we live in. Again, the author, Stephen Garber, the book is called The Seamless Life, a tapestry of love, learning, worship, and work. Steve, thanks so much for writing this, and thanks so much for taking some time to kind of walk us through it here on the BreakPoint Podcast.
John, thank you for the time to talk, and thank you especially for being my good friend and my long friend. I'm grateful for you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast, and remember, to receive your copy of Dr. Garber's book, The Seamless Life, come to breakpoint.org/Garber. That's breakpoint.org/GARBER. For the Colson Center, I'm Steve Ryder saying, do good, be awesome.